How do you write a retelling when what you're actually doing is writing a mashup of several retellings in one? Let's break down what it takes to write an effective retelling so that you don't get raked over the coals in the reviews. Now, when it comes to writing an effective retelling, your job is to identify the main plot points of the original story, not the Disney version, and make sure that you're including those in your story, because these are the things that readers are going to be looking for. In order for something to be a retelling, they have to be able to identify the original story in it and see that it's a twist on it. So think of Little Red Riding Hood, or Cinderella, or Goldilocks. What are the things you automatically think of? If I said you had to tell me what Cinderella was about right now, you would list a couple of different steps, and those would be the things that everybody thinks of and will be looking for in your stories. So once you've put all these plot points in and twisted them up so you can change the order they happen in, or how they happen, or the settings, or all sorts of things you can do to put spins on them but people can still recognize it. Once you have done that, and make sure you check out our playlist here on the channel because I have lots of tutorials on how to do this here, you're going to be aware that now you've got more than one story. So if you're writing a retelling, you only have the plot points from one story you have to work in some fashion. If, however, you are doing a mashup of 2 fairy tales or 3 fairy tales, now you have to get in all those main points from all 3 of them. And you can shift how this works. Again, you can change the schedule, how they appear, the setting they appear in, why they appear. Let's just say we're talking about Little Red Riding Hood. Now we know with Little Red Riding Hood, she goes into the woods to take bread to her grandmother, and she meets the wolf along the way, and then when she gets to her grandmother's house, the wolf is there, and all the things happen. Those are some of the main plot points. But in my story, Little Red Riding Hood is a circus aerialist, and she has to go into the woods not to take bread to her grandma, but to find her grandma, who has been out in the woods searching for new talent and hasn't come home yet. We're still sending her off into the woods to look for her grandmother in a different setting, but we've shifted a little bit of how that happens and when that happens inside of the story. I also shift when she meets the wolf and who the wolf is. I've even split my wolf into 2 different characters. It's a little spoilery, but there's some really cool things that I've done to put twists on this story that still elicit those emotions and reactions and the awareness of those plot points in the story without it being the exact same. So as you're writing your retellings, now you have to work in 3 different stories or 2 different stories to this. So keep in mind, who is your character that is representing that original character? Who is your Red Riding Hood and who is your Cinderella? Talk about those 2 characters and remember they need to have their own definitive experiences because they're representing those characters. So while you could potentially have Cinderella experience a Little Red Riding Hood plot point, you probably shouldn't. You should probably let them have their own standalone parts of the story. Now this doesn't mean you have to separate the stories out. You should figure out ways to intertwine those. What happens if Little Red Riding Hood goes out into the woods to look for Grandma and she runs into Cinderella running away from the palace? All of a sudden we've got Into the Woods, right? You want to make sure that you intertwine some of them. So some of these plot points can stand alone for the individual characters and some of them should be intertwined in some way. You can also bring in the other characters. So as Cinderella is dealing with her dress being transformed, maybe Little Red Riding Hood is there as her seamstress helping her out, and she had gone into the woods to get the fabric, and you can do all sorts of different things to kind of play into each other's stories with this. So as you're doing a mashup, your job, the thing that you're working toward, the thing you're looking for is to get in all of those plot points in a creative and unique way, in a different twisted schedule, in a different twisted setting, and then be able to intertwine those stories together so that they make sense. So you can plot this beforehand, you can figure it out as you go. You're going to want to at least do a little bit of crossover with those stories that things mesh a little bit, and then have some standalones as well. Now remember, as you're putting in these plot points, you don't have to have every single one, like 100% you don't have to have, but you do need to have 97% of those major plot points in there because people are actively looking for them. And if they can't recognize the story, it's no longer a retelling. And that means you are going to get destroyed in your review, so don't do that. So get as many plot points in there as possible, twist when you have them, where you have them, how they work, and then combine them and intertwine them whenever possible to make sure you're enhancing your story as you go. And then when you're done writing your story, get beta readers, tell them what the retelling is, and make them actively look for these things, because if they read it and don't feel like it was a retelling of that story, you're in big trouble and you gotta do some rewrites or not say that it's a retelling. There's a lot of different options out there, and you want to make sure that you are making the most out of the original stories, again, not the Disney versions, the original stories, and implement those in there. And a lot of times you are going to find as you're researching those original stories that there are things Disney ignored that you can and should be putting in your story as well. If you have more questions on how to write mashups of retellings, go ahead and drop those down below. Check out the other videos for how to write effective retellings that work really well from the fan-proclaimed queen of retellings, because I have a million of them out and they're bestsellers and still on list today. I want to make sure I'm answering your questions, so go ahead and drop those down below, and I'll see you in our next episode.